Let's give a few minutes for them to load.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session on the Belt and Road Initiative. I hope you're enjoying the conference so far. In this session, we shall be unpacking China's Belt and Road Initiative and what it means for Africa's development and dispute resolution. My name is Wairimu Karanja, and I'm an international lawyer based in Nairobi, Kenya, with experience in energy disputes, energy matters, and also commercial disputes, including Chinese investment. I will be the moderator for this session, and I am very honored to have with me 4 speakers who are experts in international arbitration and in Chinese investment in Africa, having been intimately involved in some of the biggest deals that we have seen. The speakers are Kwadwo Sarkodie, Daniel Ma, Baptiste Brigado, and Stephen Ajay, and I will briefly introduce them. Kwadwo Sarkodie is a partner at Mayer Brown LLP in the International Arbitration Group in the London office, and he has advised on projects and disputes in Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, India, Russia, and the Middle East. And he regularly appears before international tribunals such as the UNCITRAL, ICC, and LCIA tribunals. Now, you can read his full bio in the conference app. Kwadwo will be speaking on China's Belt and Road Initiative, African projects and transactions, and the opportunities that we have for Africa. We have also Daniel Ma, who is a partner in the international arbitration practice of Winston & Strawn, a global law firm. I must admit it has taken me a bit of a while to get the correct pronunciation of his name, so I'm very proud of myself. Daniel is recognized as a future leader in arbitration by Who's Who Legal 2021, and is consistently recognized by other inventories. Daniel has worked on a wide range of disputes and has quite interestingly represented clients in a number of disputes arising from the COVID-19 pandemic and associated delays in performance. You can also read his full bio in your conference app and also on the Winston & Strawn website. And Daniel will be speaking on the effect of the China-USA trade wars on relations with Africa and the COVID-19 effect on the Belt and Road Initiative. We have Baptiste Brigado, who is an associate advocate at the international law firm of Lalive based in Geneva, who also has experience working as counsel and secretary to international arbitration tribunals such as ICC, HKIAC, SIAC, SEC, CITAM in China, ICSID, and UNCITRAL. He's also a member of the ICC Commission on the Belt and Road Initiative. He will be speaking on peculiar issues in dispute resolution that may arise out of the BRI. Stephen Ajay is Senior Director of Contracts and Commercial Director at ASTAD, which is a project management consultancy organization based in Qatar. He has successfully advised on multi-billion-dollar projects, including projects by Chinese entities, and he has various qualifications in both arbitration and project management. Stephen will be speaking on the China-Africa arbitration developments and what we can expect from China-Africa relations in arbitration. Now, China's BRI spans more than 60 countries in Africa, Europe, Middle East, and Asia. And it's inevitable that commercial disputes will arise. China has opened courts in Beijing, Xi'an, Shenzhen, and has also spearheaded the China-Africa Joint Arbitration Center, or CAJA. And this panel will be discussing the opportunities presented to Africa by the BRI and how arbitration institutions in African countries can deal with the issues that arise. I'm going to be sharing my screen very shortly, and I'm going to show you the extent of China's investment in Africa. We have an overview of One Belt, One Road, which is, you can see on screen, which is what China is basically taking through the whole world, including Africa. And also very interesting from Boston University's Global Development Policy Center, you can see the proliferation of China's investment in Africa. Now, I will now hand over to Kwadwo Sarkodie, who will take us through his perspectives on China's investment transactions in Africa and opportunities for Africans. Kwadwo, over to you, and I will be sharing a few of your points for you to take us through.
Thank you so much, Warimu, for that very kind introduction. Your overview has provided an excellent starter for the scope and context of the Belt and Road Initiative, together with an illustration both of its global scale and also of its importance for Africa. Launched at the end of 2013, a globe-spanning network of sea and land trading routes originating in China is taking shape, funded by vast sums of Chinese capital. And at its heart, the BRI is about infrastructure. It's an infrastructure initiative. Some 90% of BRI projects are linked to ports, rail, road, mineral processing, or energy, and that includes oil, gas, and renewables. And all of this is on a vast and truly global scale. Now, Africa is a central element of the BRI. And we'll look now at some of the infrastructure and plans and projects which have taken place in Africa. Now, this is against the background of a substantial infrastructure challenge which Africa faces. Indeed, it's potentially the most persistent and significant hurdle to industrialization and to increased intra-African trade. It's said that approximately $68 to $108 billion will be needed by way of investment to meet Africa's infrastructure financing needs. And China, as the largest funder of infrastructure in Africa, and the BRI specifically, of course, comprises a significant influx and source of capital for this much needed infrastructure. So by way of example, China has so far invested in over 40 African countries under the BRI. There are major projects across the continent. These include in Nigeria, the $1.6 billion investment in developing the railway between Lagos and Ibadan, which opened in January 2021. This is part of a larger and much more significant project running all the way between Lagos and Kano. In Uganda, the Isimba hydroelectric power station to generate 183 megawatts of hydroelectric power, been funded to the tune of $590 million by China Exim Bank. In Ethiopia and Djibouti, the modernization of the railway link between Addis Ababa and Djibouti and the associated construction of an industrial park in South Addis Ababa was completed in January 2021. This was funded under the BRI to the tune of $3.4 billion. The question remains, however, as to whether the BRI is purely an economic construct to enhance the international cooperation between China, Africa, and the wider world, which is, of course, what China would claim, or is it a geopolitical tool to enhance China's global strategic influence, which is what has been suggested by some of China's strategic competitors. Now, the true answer probably lies somewhere in between those two extremes, and the challenge for African countries is to navigate that, to align China's ambitions with their own needs and objectives, and therefore take advantage of the synergies and opportunities which undoubtedly exist. So I move now to look at what the biggest opportunities presented for Africans associated with the BRI are. Now, there is undoubtedly a vast and unprecedented influx of funding into major infrastructure projects in Africa as a consequence of the BRI. This provides an opportunity to address long overdue gaps and shortcomings in national infrastructure, as well as to provide more effective and efficient links within sub-regions and across the continent. However, funding provided through the BRI often comes with conditions. These conditions can serve to limit the opportunities for Africans to participate. By way of example, I point to the standard gauge railway project in Kenya, which links Mombasa and Nairobi, originally planned to extend through to Uganda, which was funded by China, but on condition that it be constructed by Chinese entities. And restrictions such as these are not uncommon on BRI projects. This is very significant to be borne in mind that now, at present, some 1 in 3 major infrastructure projects undertaken in Africa are constructed by Chinese entities. And statistics show that while labour which works on constructing African BRI projects is increasingly African, the more senior staff on projects are usually Chinese. And this necessarily restricts the scope for knowledge transfer and capacity building which might otherwise take place. And it can be seen, therefore, the opportunities for participation by African contractors are often limited. However, there are and remain the potential for significant additional opportunities further down the supply chain, supplying raw materials, subcontracting, supplying, and so on. And of course, there are the important advantages which are conferred by the infrastructure assets themselves once construction has been completed. They offer a clear potential benefit to increase connectivity across Africa, and therefore offer the potential to boost intra-African trade, economic activity, and development. It must, however, be kept in mind that challenges remain. Returning to the standard gauge railway project in Kenya, this provides an example of how BRI projects do ultimately remain subject to the aims and objectives of China as the paying party. As such, it was recently seen how the objective to continue the line through to Uganda, which I just mentioned, which would have therefore provided an important link facilitating trade between 2 key regional economies, was abruptly dropped when Kenya decided against funding the next phase of the line's development. And this is a likely consequence of the Chinese government's recent steps taken against the background of the pandemic, the changing global financial landscape, the need to commit investment to China, to cut exposure to risk, and so on. The decision to scale back BRI investment and perhaps shift away from what are perceived as perhaps higher risk, low cost, and less commercial funding. And it's against that background and in that context that we have seen a drop in the levels of BRI investment over the course of the year 2020 and carrying on into this year. African parties involved in BRI projects, be they states, contractors, or suppliers, must appreciate that the risk remains that where their interests come to diverge from China, this could very likely lead in a fundamental change to the project structure, or a dispute, or a stalled project, all of which they would wish to avoid. An example here is provided from the Beijing Everyway Traffic and Lighting Company dispute being brought against Ghana at the moment under the China-Ghana Bilateral Investment Treaty, which was commenced in February 2021. And it shows how Chinese companies are perhaps becoming slightly more assertive in pursuing and protecting their perceived rights in relation to projects and investments in Africa. Now, as regards advice and disputes, there are clear opportunities for African lawyers and consultants here. Infrastructure projects on a mega project scale inevitably give rise to tensions, inevitably give rise to the prospect of disputes at all levels. As such projects will require robust and efficient mechanisms to address disputes as they arise during the contract and during the delivery of the project itself. That is to say, dispute adjudication boards, dispute review boards, and so on. And further, more significant and project critical disputes may also require international arbitration to resolve them, and it's used in addition in conjunction with other ADR methods. And we heard in the earlier panels today about the importance of the role that mediation can play, and that's certainly relevant here. And all of this,
I will come in with a 3-minute time check.
Thank you so much. So all of this underlines the importance of the work of bodies such as AFAA in promoting knowledge and practice of arbitration and dispute resolution in Africa. Now, the potential for dispute work is vast, and the range of disputes are not necessarily restricted to the Sino-African companies and states. There are other international actors involved, suppliers, funders, and so on. Now, as I come to the concluding stage of this talk, as Wairimu has reminded me, I just wanted to mention the African Continental Free Trade Area and what that might mean for the Belt and Road Initiative. This year has seen the coming into force of the Free Trade Area. It's the largest free trade area created since the coming into force of the WTO. It serves to enhance economic integration of an economic area serving a population of some 1.2 billion people, and therefore offers a further vital potential force for Africa's further development. And the Continental Free Trade Area has as its objective the deepening economic integration among African states, the creation of a unified market for goods and services, and in the process, driving Africa's industrialization and structural transformation. Now, the infrastructure gap, which I alluded to earlier on in this talk, is one of the key areas which serve to potentially limit the scope for trade. The Continental Free Trade Area focuses rightly on the removal of tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers, so therefore legal impediments to trade. But equally important are actual physical barriers, bottlenecks, restrictions in capacity of road, rail links, ports, and so on, which serve to cap and hold down the amount of trade that can physically take place in terms of passage of goods between African countries. The significant infrastructure projects and developments, which I mentioned earlier, being funded by the BRI, can serve to alleviate this. It can serve to transform the landscape in this regard. So I think looking at the BRI and the Continental Free Trade Area together is very important. I think it demonstrates how both of them do offer the potential and offer the opportunity to enhance the integration and development on the African continent. So to conclude, with such a volume of capital being committed to such major projects, this undoubtedly presents opportunities in Africa, and infrastructure investment is a clear and pressing African need. However, as can fully be expected, in committing such investment, China, of course, has its own objectives and aims foremost in mind. What Africans will need to do is be astute and aware of their legal and commercial rights, how to protect them, how to enforce them, how to ensure that risks are carefully managed and disputes are avoided if they are to take best advantage of this once-in-a-generation opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kwadwo. That was a really great start to our session. I will share again my screen, showing you what Kwadwo was discussing, the scope of the BRI, infrastructure and interconnectivity, the challenges and opportunities for Africans and the African Continental Free Trade Area and what that means. And I've shared a little bit of snippets from what Kwadwo spoke about. I then move on, and we have questions. I can see we do have some questions coming in, which we will take care of in the Q&A. I will now move on to Daniel. It's your time to, based in the US, tell us about the effect of the China-USA trade wars, if at all, on Africa, and also, based on your advice on COVID-19, what is its effect on the BRI in Africa? Thank you, Daniel, and please take us forward.
Great. Thank you, Wairimu, for those kind words of introduction. Many thanks as well to the AFAA for inviting me to speak here today. Like everyone else, I'm sad we couldn't gather in person, but my thanks to the organizers for implementing this conference virtually in such an effective way. It's a real pleasure to be here today speaking on this fascinating topic, and as Wairimu mentioned, I will be specifically talking about through the US-China Trade War, the event of the COVID pandemic and the extent to which these have impacted the Belt and Road Initiative in Africa. Just a couple words briefly on my own experience, and I'll try and draw on these in some of the comments I'll make today. I have in the past represented some clients against Chinese state-owned entities in infrastructure projects in an arbitration setting, and where there are issues such as overspend and delay by the Chinese entities operating a project. And then as Wairimu mentioned, more recently, probably like many others here, I've worked on a number of COVID-related disputes where there is delay in a supply chain or delay to a project as a result of COVID, including in one case, a dispute with a manufacturer of industrial equipment based in China and delays at the border coming out of China. So a recap on the US-China trade war that really began in around January 2018 under former US President Trump, when tariffs were first imposed on incoming goods from China and into the US. It started with fairly narrow categories of goods, things like solar panels, residential washing machines, but then in the course of 2018 and 2019, both sides imposed tariffs on hundreds of categories of goods worth hundreds of billions of dollars. And as we all know through the media, through press reports, that is obviously a very significant trade war going on over the course of years. One of the many impacts, one of the many consequences of the trade war has been a decrease in US demand for Chinese exports, and that means a decrease in Chinese demand for industrial metals and other commodities for China's manufacturing processes. So that is one area where there is some evidence of an impact of the trade war on, in particular, commodity exporting nations around the world that export commodities to China, including from Africa. One of the clearest examples of that, looking at the data, if you look at the export of cobalt from DRC to China, in 2018, when the trade war was only just commencing, that had a total value of exported cobalt of approximately $4 billion. And 1 year later, 2019, when the trade war was in full swing, that had halved to $2 billion worth of cobalt. That it indicates at least some correlation to a decrease in US import of electronics where cobalt is used in the manufacture from China. What was also happening during that time, and I'll come back to this in a moment, but from around mid-2019 onwards, so again, when the trade war was in full swing, we see some shift in policy from China as to the Belt and Road commitments abroad. And correlation is not necessarily causation, but certainly the timing does seem to line up to the trade war being at a fairly high crescendo at that point. Tracking through into 2020, in January 2020, there was a truce of sorts agreed between the US and Chinese governments. They agreed what was called the Phase 1 trade deal. Both sides made provisional commitments to de-escalate. Now, in that very same month of January 2020, with the ink barely dry on that trade deal, one of the first medical studies was published of a novel coronavirus that had emerged from Wuhan, China. We all know what happened next as the virus spread around the world with devastating effect and continues to do so. From a commercial perspective, supply chains have been in particular disrupted, redirected. All businesses have had to grapple with government lockdowns, public health precautions, reduced employee capacity, border closures and restrictions. And clearly this means strained contractual relationships along the supply chain and circumstances leading to a perfect storm for commercial disputes. And Belt and Road projects are no exception. They will have suffered as well from the effects of COVID and the delays therein. As for the trade war, this shows no sign of abatement under recently inaugurated US President Joe Biden. a recent summit held between US and Chinese officials in Alaska just a month ago in March, kicked off with the leading diplomats in attendance, essentially trading insults. There's since followed an expansion of existing US sanctions on Chinese entities and individuals and counter sanctions by China on US individuals. And meanwhile, the tariffs that have been imposed by both sides from 2018 onwards remain largely in place. So what does this mean for Chinese investment in Africa, and specifically the Belt and Road Initiative? Not clear if the trade war has actually impacted the Belt and Road Initiative, but as I mentioned before, there has been a scaling back of Belt and Road commitments and a shift in Chinese government policy from around mid-2019 onwards. There were reports from around July 2019 of Chinese lenders increasingly rejecting funding for Belt and Road projects. There's one external study by Boston University's Global Development Policy Center, which shows that whereas in 2016, the main Chinese policy banks, the state-owned banks that lend for Belt and Road projects, they had lent around $75 billion for Belt and Road projects. That was in 2016. In 2019, that number was down to $4 billion. So still a lot of money, but a major drop in lending and a major drop in commitment. And there are other reports of shifts announced by the Chinese government to refocus on domestic projects in China and to some extent scale back some of the Belt and Road ambitions. And as an arbitration lawyer, those shifts already indicate ample grounds for arbitration disputes. Funding is withdrawn, purse strings are tightened on a large-scale project, and that will expose underlying issues with the project. Costs, overruns, any delay that's already there will be exposed even further. And that could be particularly the case with Belt and Road projects, where there are sometimes reported issues with Chinese state-owned contractors incurring very high operational costs. As to the impact of COVID on Belt and Road projects in Africa, that, as I mentioned, has caused further delay and increase in costs. In June 2020, an official from China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs admitted that about at least 20% of Belt and Road projects had been, quote, seriously affected by COVID, citing everything we know, the restrictions on travel, government lockdowns, etc. We also saw in the course of 2020 various African governments taking steps to reset on certain Belt and Road projects. We had, for example, in April 2020, President of Tanzania announcing a cancellation or at least postponement of the port at Bagamoyo. In May 2020, Nigerian legislators voted for a review of all of China's loans for all Chinese projects in Nigeria in order to assess the terms of those loans. Now, these types of developments may have happened anyway without a trade war, without a pandemic, but perhaps these major events accelerated some of these discussions and some of this, soul searching and analysis of really what the value of these projects are.
Daniel, I will come in with a 3-minute time check.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's perfect, because I'll wrap up in the next couple minutes with, I guess, just a few observations of what I think are likely dispute trends arising as a result, especially of COVID, but also as a result of this scaling back by Chinese government and Chinese lenders. So I'd highlight four potential trends. One, as a result of COVID-19, I mentioned supply chain disruption is something we've seen, delays to construction, operation of infrastructure projects. Suppliers and contractors will have already been asserting claims like force majeure, hardship, frustration, material adverse change. And the question will be whether that claim of force majeure is legitimate or whether that's cover for exiting a bad deal. So these are some of the disputes we're seeing come through now as we're 1 year on, and some of those will proceed to arbitration. The second trend is with this reduced Chinese lending, as I mentioned previously, that will expose existing overspend or delays and lead to disputes between parties as to who will foot the bill. And to the extent there's any locally owned entity that holds a minority interest in a project, that could mean disputes with a Chinese state-owned counterpart, contractual counterpart holding majority interest. Thirdly, third potential trend, if there is any, there has been some level of COVID-related debt relief by lenders, including Chinese lenders. And the question is when that debt relief comes to an end, whether there's any risk of the Chinese lenders exercising security rights, taking control of a project. And we saw just a couple weeks ago, the Chinese embassy in South Sudan issuing a denial of an intent to take control of the Juba International Airport. So clearly this is a live issue. Fourthly and finally, as with any significant market disruption, parties to long-term contracts might seek to trigger price adjustment clauses due to a change in circumstances, such as that disruption caused by COVID-related legislation or the drop in funding from Chinese lenders. So I will leave it there for now. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to the further Q&A.
All right, thank you very much, Daniel, for taking us through that. And for the participants, we've put in a few snippets there from Daniel's presentation. We shall deal with the questions that we have seen on the app in the Q&A session. I now hand over to you, Baptiste, to speak about the peculiar issues that you see arising from the BRI initiative. And I have shared some of the issues that you're going to discuss. Over to you, Baptiste.
Thank you very much, Wai. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of the conference, obviously, for putting this wonderful conference together. Despite the difficult circumstances, I think you should be all very proud of yourselves for this tour de force. And of course, thanking our wonderful moderator for masterfully organizing this panel and steering our discussions today. Now, my topic is what makes BRI disputes different from other World Trade Development initiatives. And it is very interesting as this topic should help us discern which experiences can be shared from other World Trade Development initiatives and what is specific to the BRI. Daniel's just mentioned some trends of types of disputes, which I agree with from my experience as well. And I will focus on bringing out the main features of these disputes once they're launched and how they're different or not from other investment initiatives. So as we heard from Guido, the BRI gets a lot of media and political attention, and the Chinese government certainly portrays it as a century-defining initiative, a one-of-a-kind opportunity, although it's really the resurrection of roads that have existed for millennials. As to the economic and geopolitical level, the BRI is undoubtedly one of a kind. Economically, there has never been so much capital and effort poured into an investment initiative, absent any need for reconstruction after a war. And geopolitically, the geographic scope of the BRI and its political impact on international relations make the BRI also a remarkable initiative. So, given the type and size of the projects involved in the BRI, disputes have automatically arisen and they will continue to arise, with their resolution being a key element determining the outcome of the initiative as a whole. That is, either they are resolved efficiently and they do not signal the end of a relevant project when they arise, or they are not resolved efficiently and they result in the stalling or abandonment of the project and the resulting bad publicity for the initiative as a whole. So in the next 8 minutes or 9 minutes, I will start with what is not different with the BRI disputes, and then highlight what is different with these disputes and why is it important to know and manage these differences to resolve these disputes efficiently, both as an external lawyer, but also as an in-house counsel involved in these projects. So let's start with my first point, which is that BRI disputes appear to be no different from other disputes which we are all used to. I'm going to start, unsurprisingly, with some statistics from the ICC. Mostly as a member of the ICC Belt and Road Commission, I have this perk. Statistics because we all love some statistics, and jokes aside, because they show what we're actually dealing with in terms of disputes. So BRI disputes, focusing, of course, here on arbitration disputes. So those that arise, commercial arbitration disputes, I should say, those that arise from commercial contracts. These BRI disputes are no different from those that we are used to seeing. If we're talking about sectors, the sectors which are frequent users of commercial arbitration are those involved in BRI disputes. ICC statistics show that energy, construction amounted to 27% of the ICC court total caseload in 2018, which is the most recent year where the statistics were compiled. And 35%, so energy and construction amounted to 35% of the ICC ADR center caseload, so mostly mediation and dispute boards cases. And of course, energy and construction, as we heard from Quadwo, are two of the biggest with infrastructure sectors that are relevant to the BRI. If we're looking at the parties that are frequent users of commercial arbitration are also those that are involved in BRI disputes. From a geographical point of view, out of a total of 2,282 parties involved in ICC arbitration cases in 2018, over 1,000 were incorporated in the 93 Belt and Road countries. So that's approximately 46% of all parties involved in ICC arbitration cases in 2018. In 2018, the top 5 most active BRI countries in ICC arbitration were Italy with 87 cases, followed by the UAE, 69 cases, Turkey, 62 cases, the People's Republic of China, 59 cases, and South Korea, 54. Now, we've talked about sectors, parties. The projects themselves are also, the BRI projects are no different from other initiatives, investment initiatives. Mega construction projects are also frequent users of ADR mechanisms. ADR mechanisms being dispute boards, mediation, or arbitration, and the BRI mega projects are no different. We know that multi-tiered dispute resolution clauses involving a combination of mediation, arbitration, and dispute boards are also frequently used in large BRI construction projects. Now, there are other types of disputes that are also not different from what we've seen in the past, and these are the disputes over state-to-state loans and sovereign debts. As we've heard before, BRI projects are driven by state initiative and state financing, and they are mostly financed through government-to-government loans, where the money is provided by governments and then it trickles down to projects on the ground. Disputes over these loans do not result automatically in formal court or arbitration cases, but rather in state-to-state negotiations, which is, again, not different from other state-to-state negotiations unrelated to the BRI. And within the BRI, what is interesting is that the PRC, China, is playing the negotiation and diplomatic game as well as other Occidental states which have been involved in such kinds of disputes in the past, notably because of its immense bargaining power. There may be differences in the solutions yielded by these negotiations, these state-to-state negotiations. I'm thinking most recently about the example of involving Sri Lanka, where Sri Lanka defaulted on a loan provided by China within the Belt and Road context, and the PRC was granted the right to use a major port in Sri Lanka as a military base for 99 years as a quote-unquote lease. So,
Baptiste, I come in with a time check. 3 minutes, please.
So now let me tell you what is different from with the BRI disputes. As I said, BRI projects involve a large amount of state intervention. And what does that mean on what the disputes are? It means that disputes are often resolved in parallel to the courtroom. The strategy of negotiating out of courts is in line with the PRC culture to negotiate or mediate disputes instead of litigating them. So one of the ways for host state or companies to gain leverage in this negotiation is to make sure they can enforce their rights through an efficient, independent, and binding dispute resolution mechanism. In other words, if you can enforce your rights under a contract through a mechanism which will be able to counter Chinese SOE's reluctance to participate in the BR process, and which will yield an enforceable result, then you will have a greater impact and power in the parallel negotiations. An efficient dispute resolution mechanism becomes a tool to be used to gain leverage in negotiations in relations to these BRI project disputes. Of course, with relations to these disputes, you may never get to an award, but you can influence the outcome of the negotiations out of the courtroom in your favor by, as Quadro was saying, using an efficient and repeated dispute resolution mechanism. That's the first difference. Let me mention two other differences. The second difference is that with respect to the BRI, there is a lack of dedicated ISDS mechanism covering BRI and investments. As we all know, as we've heard yesterday, there is a functioning investment disputes settlement mechanism, which is mostly dealt with by ICSID, which was created after the war to resolve issues between investors and states. But there is so far no dedicated dispute resolution system for the BRI just yet. It is important since there are ISDS disputes relating to the BRI, even in Africa, which are dealt with by ICSID. The recent one, which was mentioned by Quadro, is the one registered against Ghana by a Chinese tech company, which had been granted a concession to build and operate a smart traffic system in Ghana. The third big difference, which I would be remiss not to mention, is the impact of environmental and social issues in disputes, these two aspects, environmental and social issues, were not really discussed in relation to past investment initiatives. As you may have heard, the Chinese Prime Minister mentioned in 2019 that the BRI would be a green, healthy, and intelligent and peaceful initiative. What does it mean in practice? It means further involvement of international environmental regulations and laws in the disputes. It also means larger involvement of local and international NGOs in the dispute resolution process. That is an aspect that is well known to lawyers who have experience in mining disputes, but not in all sectors. But these types of BRI projects undoubtedly result in disputes involving social support for those projects. And the lawyers dealing with these disputes have to know how to use these issues and the issue, especially of social support, to their client's advantage. Another result of these aspects being at the forefront of BRI disputes is the fact that political support for those projects would be less stable, given that it is political support often tied to social acceptance of a project. But withdrawal of a political support for a project can mean the death of a project, and thus disputes as to the responsibilities for the cancellation and compensation for such cancellation.
1 minute.
So there you go. You've got those three main differences. That's it for me, White. Thank you very much for all of your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Baptiste, for that intervention. Definitely very interesting. I wish we had more time. I've put in a few snippets for the people for all our audience to catch up on. I will now call upon, and we shall deal with your questions in the Q&A. And I remind everyone that on your Hoover Conference app, there are 2 poll questions. One, on the benefits, on whether you think that the BRI is generally beneficial to Africa, and two, on whether BRI disputes are different from other disputes. And these are issues that have been covered by the speakers so far. So please go to your Hoover app, conference app, and answer the 4 questions. Right now, I'm going to call upon Stephen Ajay to discuss the China-Africa arbitration developments and the BRI. I will share my screen in that regard. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Wairimu. As we draw the curtain down on our session, I would seize the opportunity to thank the FAA for giving us this platform to discuss the Belt and Road Initiative. I also want to express appreciation to the attendees for listening to us. And in this session, I'm going to go through, well, before I continue, I would also want to say, difficult as it has been with the impact of the pandemic, I believe opportunities for innovation have also increased, for which reason we are here on this platform. So I just hope that this innovation will continue and transform our industry and the services that we provide. In my speech, I'm going to just wrap up or refresh the listeners on the background to the China Belt and Road Initiative. My colleague Kojo has spoken in detail about it, but as we run down, I would only refresh our attendees on the background to the initiative. I would also talk about investment trends so far, and then talk about what that means to dispute resolution across Africa, and close it down with whether or not Africa is ready, to deal with the opportunities and challenges that come along with the BRI initiative. So talking about the background, refreshing us on the background, it would appear that China has a huge pot of money that they want to expend several trillions of that cash in investment across the world. So far China has been doing business across the world for a long time, but in the latter part of 2013, they made a public declaration that they want to commit to specific investment across the world, comprising investment along the road, which they call Belt, and then the maritime part, which they call Road. China previously traded from mainland China through to Europe by land, and that is what they refer to as the Belt investment. But since 2013, they have made commitment to extend this across the maritime Silk, which they also refer to as 21st century Silk Route, and this extend all the way through to Africa, Southern America, and some part of North America. Between 2013 and now, or 2020, the close of 2020, some 138 countries have signed up to MOU for the BRI initiative. And these 138 countries come from about seven regions, namely East Asia, West Asia, Africa, Middle East, South America, Europe, and North America. And between this period of 2013 and 2020, China has invested some over $700 billion across these 7 regions. And percentage-wise, about 20% on average across the 5% has been invested in Africa. So if we look at the percentage spread of investment across these 7 regions, Asia, East and West Asia has the highest, and Africa is the 3rd, before you go to South America, Europe, and so on and so forth. So you'd expect that with a huge investment from China to Africa, this will generate opportunities for Africa. But then, as Kojo mentioned, construction and investment business always has disputes along with it. So this will not go away without any dispute arising from the investment. So what do Africans do? I mean, African arbitration institutions and practitioners, what do they do when these disputes arise? There are a few challenges that persist within our continent, which is variant national legal systems, variant cultural behaviors. We have the attitude of doing business with China. And then another challenge that we foresee that will arise is the China insisting that some of these disputes, or if not most of them, be taken back to China for resolution. And Kojo mentioned that China, when they sign in this MOU, they insist that Chinese organizations will do the construction, which will also filter down to their supply chain. So you end up having a Chinese organization preventing the funding and a majority of the delivery partners also coming from China. So if you're going to dispute, it is very obvious that the arbitration seat or the dispute seat to be leading towards China. So this is something that African arbitration institutions and practitioners bear in mind. But you would also observe that the Chinese, as a nation and the way they deal with disputes, they are more of the ADR kind of arbitration nature. I mean, dispute resolution nature. And obviously, because the awards are mostly private and not published and so on and so forth. So yeah, mediation is something that they practice mostly towards China. And since the rise of, or since the inception of the BRI, China has established dispute tribunals. And these are specifically instituted to deal with disputes that arise from the BRI. So what does this actually mean to African institutions and practitioners? Are we ready to deal with the challenges that come from this initiative? In 2018, the ICC made certain changes to their own guidelines to accommodate the influx of disputes that will arise from the BRI. And you wonder that if you put Europe, North America, South America together, the proportion of investment from China is not even up to that which is expended in Africa, as a continent. So you ask the question why ICC. I know my colleague Daniel Ma will talk about ICC, but the question is, why is ICC preparing themselves so much for disputes that will come from the BRI? If disputes arise from the Asian region, I suppose Singapore and Hong Kong will be the area that they'll be going to. So what happens to Africa when disputes arise? 20% of over 700 billion between 2013 and 2020, they have expended in excess of 20% of 700 billion. So what have we done, if any, to deal with the challenges that will arise from the initiative? It is refreshing that in 2015, the Chinese led an institution called the CAJAC in South Africa. And before we started the session, I quickly went to the website to make sure I'm up to date on what is happening on the website. And when I went there, you find the CAJAC rules. And then the next thing you find is the website is under construction. 20% of 700 billion have been expended to date. And we don't have information on the website, and it is under construction. I also mentioned that there is a lot of—
come in with a time check.
Okay, I also mentioned that the pandemic has brought about a lot of innovation. I believe we will deploy the innovation to make sure, because it's important that we keep records of these things so that the institutions and practitioners will be able to draw on this information to deal with the situations as they arise. You would also realize that these BRI initiatives are dealt at government level and they sign MOU. So these projects, these huge sums of money are dealt with on the back of MOUs. And when these things are signed at government levels, you are definitely going to have politicians signing up these MOU. So do they review the MOUs properly to ensure that all risks have been properly catered for? And this is where I think, especially within Africa, because of our variant cultural and political situation, we need to come together, work closely with the AU. And it is also refreshing that recently the AU came together, Africa came together and the AU to agree on a rejection of AstraZeneca. How refreshing that is. I believe they can come together and also deal with the issues that will come up from the BRI. But this is huge sums of money. And when the Chinese come, it is not only their money that they bring in, they also take, we don't go with empty hands. Sometimes we put on the table sovereign bond and so on and so forth. So we also contribute to the investment. And we have to make sure that the terms and conditions of this MOU are properly written so that the risk is equally shared and Africa will not suffer so much. And in terms of setting up these MOUs, we must ensure that the dispute resolution mechanism is even out so that disputes arising in Africa will be dealt with in Africa. And I noticed that recently cases coming up, particularly from Ghana, was taken to the ICC in London to deal with. I mean, we have institutions in Africa, we have practitioners in Africa who are equally good to deal with these issues in Africa. This is the only way we can develop the institutions and the structures that we have in dispute resolution in Africa. And we must insist that these things are properly catered for in the preparation of the MOU. So Kajak, what has Kajak done so far? I know they are doing well. They are doing well, but I think there is more that we can do. And it is very, very, I would want to say that the AFAA has a very important role to play. We need to work closely with the African Union to ensure that matters concerning BRI and the MOU are properly dealt with. The structure, the content are properly written so that we will be able to deal with the issues when they arise. And also we must establish the structures in Africa to make sure, and I mentioned Ghana because I come from Ghana, apologies. We are talking about Africa now. So that structures in Africa are properly constructed to deal with these issues and matters when they are referred to them in Africa. So I think I've taken so much time already, and I will bring the discussion to a halt for now, and then I will answer any questions that come up later on. So I'll hand it back to you, Wairimu. Thank you very much for the time given me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stephen. That was a really great intervention. You covered the Belt and Road Initiative, the investment trends that we've seen. Certainly 20% of 700 billion is a great lot. And the fact that it's covered in MOUs is a question for us as African professionals to consider. We've covered disputes in Kajak. There's not been too much activity there, but there's still yet to be seen. We now have 30 minutes for the session, for the Q&A session. We'll take about 20 minutes for the Q&A session. And I will throw it back to you, Kwadwo. There was a question that we had on China's investment went down in 2020, but there have been, renegotiation of some contracts and taking over of some contracts by African governments. Is this trend going to continue? Has that contributed? Tell us a little bit about that. You're muted.
I beg your pardon. Thank you so much. And that is an interesting question. It relates to an issue that I touched on earlier. And interestingly, listening to Daniel's talk, I noted that he pointed to a number of examples there as well, which I found particularly interesting. So it is certainly an extremely relevant issue. I think what these reflect often is either that there's been some misalignment from the outset, or otherwise a gradual divergence of interests between China as the funding and or delivering entity and the African country where the asset and the project is located. Now, this can obviously be a natural consequence over time. Interests do diverge. Countries and contracting entities want different things. And the purpose of the contract, the structure, and the advisors is to ensure that that can be catered for and managed smoothly, and ideally can avoid the prospect of an acrimonious dispute. So what I see as the important thing from the African perspective is to recognize this prospect from the outset and make preparations contractually and commercially. So therefore, when the time comes when a renegotiation is required, or a particular term might be found to be onerous for one party or the other, it does not come out of the blue. There are provisions there in place to manage that. Now, that may include dispute resolution provisions. It equally may include milestones under the concession agreement, whereby at certain stages renegotiation takes place. I think it's sensible to actually make clear which particular provisions can be the subject to renegotiation and what can and can't be adjusted at that time, because that gives both sides predictability. And what I think that serves to do is avoid the prospect of either a deadlock in negotiations, leading to a breakdown, leading to arbitration, and or a precipitate termination, which again results in I'm sure an acrimonious dispute and arbitration or other means, execution of security and so on, which ultimately will not be in the interests of either party. So I think this is really about anticipating this, recognizing this as a prospect from the outset, and providing for it. Therefore, when renegotiation takes place, it can take place in a constructive manner.
Thank you very much, Kwado. That is certainly very, very true. Negotiation is definitely something that requires a lot of, I think, consideration and capacity building for African governments. I will now move on to you, Daniel. We have a question from Kamal Shah, which is not so central to your discussion, but to other discussions, but I'd like to hear your view. With the imbalance of the negotiating power between China and Africa, what geopolitical challenges do you see, and can they really be resolved through arbitration? What do you think, especially in the context of the US-China trade wars?
Sure, thank you. Well, as I think everyone's touched on, really the starting point is whatever contractual framework or MOU framework there is at the outset. And when there is such an imbalance or potential imbalance at that stage, that can lead to issues and intractable issues later on. I think as much attention as possible at those early stages to that contractual framework, to mechanisms, and Kwado was also just mentioning these, to really set points in time in the course of the project where the progress can be checked, especially when you have a situation of Chinese lenders and Chinese implementing party contractor, to avoid a situation of cost overrun and delay to a point of no return. Building in mechanisms to allow local state entities or or other corporations to take over the operation of a project at some point in time. And we've heard about the example of the railway in Kenya, and the shift in operation of that. One other idea I just wanted to mention, having seen this in the context of a joint operating agreement for the operation of an oil field. What you see in those types of contracts are, two or more participating interest holders, maybe a minority and a majority, and what those contracts will typically have is a mechanism for setting the budget for the year ahead, approving major expenditures over a certain amount. And so to the extent that host governments or local state entities or other corporations might be involved as a minority interest holder in projects, that could be an idea for, having some level of actual, control and a way to push back on the Chinese entities that are operating a project. And so that may be a way to right the ship and create a little bit of balance when there's otherwise quite a bit of imbalance.
All right, and I will bring in another question that has come in on the app from Bonky John Paul, slightly sensitive there, but I'll throw it to you. How far is it certain that the Belt and Road Initiative is not a form of governance to achieve economic and consequently political dominance in other countries? And I'll add my bit, especially considering the US-China trade wars. Is there a way to answer that question? It's been asked. What can you say about that?
Well, it's difficult to say. I mean, that does require a macro view where we are, or I am, just a humble arbitration lawyer. I won't try and comment on the full, whether it represents political dominance or not. I think certainly when and it wouldn't just be true of Belt and Road projects, anywhere where there is one side that is funding and implementing a project, you will have the imbalance I was just talking about. And so it's a question of trying to build in checks and balances to counteract that. And certainly there are discussions and views held that some projects are too far dominated by the Chinese side in a given project, and then there are other projects where you can see some pushback on that, and we should add there are, I'm sure, plenty of projects that work out just fine, or at least do deliver quality infrastructure and benefit. So although we are focused on the situations that go wrong, there are upsides to this. But as I say, I think it's a question of finding ways to redress that imbalance through the contractual mechanisms.
Thank you very much for that. Certainly have answered the question in the context, very well, in the context of making sure there are contractual mechanisms to cover any issues that may arise. I will now move on from you, Daniel, to Baptiste. Baptiste, you mentioned some of the similarities and differences between Chinese investment disputes and foreign investment disputes, and what makes them have a special character, if at all. Now, I'll move on to say, do you think that the special character requires specific forums like CAJAC, or do you think this is something that can be handled by other institutions like the African institutions?
So, I mean, the question is, what are we talking about? Chinese investment disputes. These are investment disputes that would be brought by Chinese investors, or where China is the respondent state. At the moment, I believe there are 7 cases at exit that have been brought pending or either concluded that have been brought by Chinese investors. We certainly heard about the Everyway case versus Ghana. and there are 5 cases where China was respondent. I would argue, and in fact, I am in line with the poll on the app on that topic. I would argue that they're not really different, these cases, from other foreign investment disputes. If we're thinking, of course, of governing law, they're almost all based on bilateral investment treaties, and they are resolved under international law. If we're thinking of sectors, they're also the sectors involved in those disputes are those which are big users of investment arbitration dispute resolution mechanisms. These sectors are, of course, construction, real estate, or high tech. But there's certainly, coming to the second limb of your question, there's certainly a push to set up initiatives, whether there are new arbitration centers or new investment treaties with different clauses that would better adapt to these disputes, or at least that's what that's what some advocates for those disputes, for those initiatives, are saying. It could also be that these new initiatives are, and especially these new investment treaties are put together to better further the signatory parties' interests and especially the interest of the investors of the signatory parties. KJAC is, of course, a good and I submit very interesting example of those initiatives. What it is, either KJAC or the other initiatives, what are they going to change about the investor-state dispute settlement system as we know it, is really remains to be seen, because of course it KJAC seems to be being influenced or taking guidance from other well-known arbitral institutions. So that remains to be seen, what is the dramatic change that is going to be pushed through these initiatives. But there's certainly a push by states, China, of course, being at the forefront, to build an alternative ISDS system, alternative to what is currently in place. And I think it's an exciting time for us arbitration lawyers to see what comes out of it, and somehow get involved to learn from these regional initiatives.
Thank you very much, Baptiste. Now I have a question here for you, Stephen, from on the app from Diogratius Ntenziriayo. I hope I have got that correct. Does the fact that there is a fast-growing development of arbitral institutions in Africa pose any problem in the rendering of effective arbitration service? What do you say to that?
Right. Thank you to the colleague who asked the question. You see, having many institutions is a good thing. However, if they don't work towards the same ethos, if they don't work towards the same vision, if I may put it, then it becomes challenging, particularly since this BRI is kind of new-ish in our continent, and it is only going to increase in terms of the levels of investment post-COVID, which is now. We need to make sure we have a good handle on the matters and the resolution of those matters when they arise in Africa. Therefore, it will be proper to have a concerted view collated together in a form of African position of what we want to do in Africa. So therefore, at these initial stages, if we can have very few, if not only AFAA, to write up what we expect in terms of dealing with matters or disputes that arise from the BRI. I think at these initial stages, it will be important to have very few with properly laid out rules and guidelines as to how disputes must be resolved on our continent, in my opinion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Stephen, that's a great answer. I see you've also answered the questions that we had from Susan Rattray and from Tohib Amuda. Please, everyone, go to the Q&A for that. Because we only have about 10 minutes left to close this session, I am now going to call for closing remarks from each of you. And in your closing remarks, I will ask you to consider 2 questions, and these are 2-minute closing remarks. The first question is from the app, and it asks, so is the BRI overall beneficial to African countries? Please consider that as you answer the question. That is from Amaka Igwe. And the second question is from Dr. Emilia Onyema, who asks, how do we as Africans ensure a balance in the absence of model MOUs and the obvious power imbalance? So basically, generally, how do we ensure as Africans that we actually benefit from the BRI? I'll start with you, Kwadwo, before I move on to Daniel.
Thank you so much, and thank you for doing such a fantastic job of moderating this panel and keeping the discussion flowing, and for those excellent and very stimulating questions. Now, I think that it's clear, looking at effectiveness, first of all, the BRI will be effective on China's terms. China is providing the money, it has its reasons, its strategic objectives, which it sees, which is expanding Chinese access to new markets, enhancing Africa-China trade, facilitating Chinese access to raw materials, and in the context of a broader and more general global expansion. But what we're interested in here, I beg your pardon, are Africa's terms. And we've heard from all the speakers, the opportunities are clearly there. However, there is an imbalance in power, in influence, where one party is providing the funding and is imposing conditions and is able to do so because if they if those were not accepted, the money would go elsewhere. That is a clear imbalance. And we heard it when Daniel answered the interesting question that Kamal raised about dispute resolution, how those balances can be mitigated and be addressed. Now, for me, certainly, it is the provisions with regard to arbitration and understanding of arbitration are just as relevant, in fact, more relevant, where there's an imbalance in power. Because where there's an imbalance in power, the party who is at the wrong end, as it were, of that imbalance needs every tool they can to try and address that. So therefore, whereas arbitrations may not necessarily lead all the way through to an award that's determined in favor of the African state, because along the way there might be pressures, there might be threats to future projects and so on, which lead to a settlement. Nevertheless, the raising and the careful articulating and pursuit of a claim shows that they will not roll over, will not accept the first offer that's made, will be able to push for a more equitable settlement where there is a dispute and a divergence. So it just serves to underline, as my colleague Stephen Ajay explained, making sure that the terms are as clearly considered and as fair as possible, making sure that the potential risks are anticipated and allowed for. And where issues and differences do arise, acknowledging that there is that difference and divergence in bargaining power, but ensuring that the party in the weaker position bargains as hard as they can. So at the risk of sounding trite as I conclude this, I really want to emphasize the importance of being careful and deliberate with regard to these provisions and contractual mechanisms, because what you need to do is be belt and braces when it comes to Belt and Road. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That is something to remember. We must have belts and braces when it comes to the Belt and Road. And now I turn to you, Daniel, for your closing remarks.
Great, thank you. I don't have anything as catchy as that, but that's a fantastic sentiment, and I think it captures it well. So thank you, Kwadwo. I think I'll probably, in many ways, repeat many of the thoughts that I completely agree with that Kwadwo just said by way of conclusion. But you know, going back to those questions you mentioned, Wairimu, and thank you again for excellent moderating today. You know, is the BRI beneficial to African countries, and how do we as Africans ensure a balance? You know, taking the first question, any infrastructure project anywhere in the world can be, of course, beneficial, as I mentioned before, and can result in you know, fantastic benefits once it's in place. But the question can become, regardless of whether it's Chinese investment, US, European, or elsewhere, you know, ownership over that project in the long term, technology transfer, and whether you know, ultimately a host country is left with a project that's far over budget, way too late, and is still controlled by external interests. So I think it, as I've mentioned previously, it's a question of going to every single one of the potential contractual controls you could put in place as you create a framework around a project, both at the lending and design and stages, and through to implementation and operation, and setting as many control points as you can, whether those are through operating committees where certain matters are reserved and can only be approved with the approval of a local partner, or whether ultimately you do have arbitration as a backstop. And I can only really echo Stephen's comments previously, that the AFAA is clearly extremely well placed to help spearhead that type of initiative and really help ensure that all relevant contractual documentation around Belt and Road projects is well written and well constructed in a way that addresses that imbalance, and it presents an opportunity to bring together collective knowledge within Africa when negotiating these deals. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I have a time check from the AFAA. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll now turn to Baptiste. Please, your 2 minutes closing remarks, and then we can move on to Steve.
Okay, I'll try to be brief, although I'll try to answer your 2 questions and also a question that was posed by Stephen about why the ICC is working on building its capacities in relation to the BRI, because I'm guilty. I'm a member of the ICC Belt and Road Commission, and of course the ICC, through its Belt and Road Commission, but also through its Africa Commission, is looking to see and learn about the BRI and how it can adapt and assist parties and users of ICC arbitration, both Chinese actually and international parties, of course, to achieve their interests. I can say that one of the, and I will repeat myself from my presentation and also repeat what my 2 colleagues just said. Of course, if you manage to, the best way I think to secure that balance between the interest in the contract is to make sure that if you do have a right that is being breached by one of the parties, you have a strong dispute resolution mechanism to enforce it. Strong meaning coming from an arbitral institution that is reputable, and if you do get to an award, it will be enforced, and it will be enforced quickly. Of course, as I said, a lot of users of ICC are from BRI countries, and including from African countries. So I guess my final words are that it's an exciting time to study and learn and guide parties through these different initiatives, whether it be arbitration initiative for new arbitration centers or for new investment protection treaties. And the good thing is that I think it's a good thing, and I think we agree with Stephen, the good thing about having a lot of different options of arbitration centers and a lot of different options of dispute resolution mechanisms means that when you are in a negotiation on these BRI contracts, you have different options, and you're not tied with the package that is given to you by the Chinese operator. You can suggest alternatives, you can suggest alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, you can suggest alternative substantive laws, and you have those different alternatives which you will have obviously beforehand studied and made sure that they work well, that they're robust, and that will mean that you will be able, through these different alternatives, to suggest either at the negotiation stage or at the dispute stage solutions that will help secure, hopefully, the balance between the two parties, although bargaining powers might look imbalanced.
Thank you very much, Baptiste. Thank you for that. Stephen, your closing remarks, please.
Thank you, and I'll be very brief on this. I think it is true that Africa, most parts of Africa, has a huge deficit on infrastructure. Therefore, any investment towards Africa is a good thing. However, when these investors do come in, we need to encourage them, as my colleagues have said in various forms, to build capacity within Africa, because that is the only way the structures will be developed. So we need to encourage them. However, because particularly on the BRI is done at government level, these things are not properly reviewed. So I'm just encouraging the AFAA to start coordinating, working with the government at the various, because we don't have a regulatory body per se, we may have to work at national levels, at government levels, and encourage them. Look, they want to win elections, so they'll sign anything to have the investors say as quickly as possible. But we want to make sure that these things, this investment, we will repay. We will repay. So we have to make sure we get a fair share of the risk properly transferred. And AFAA, I believe we have the capacity, I keep mentioning in the name, because we have the capacity to make sure that these things are done properly. So Africa is looking up to AFAA to make sure the structures are properly laid out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you to all the speakers. AFAA, you are listening, so I hope you're up to the task that Stephen has thrown to you. Before we close this session, we have about 2 minutes to go. I just want to take us back to the poll. Do you think BRI will have a positive impact on Africa's development? Thank you very much. 40 people participated, 33 of you said yes. More than 40 people participated, 33 said yes. 9 said no, so yes, BRI will have a positive impact on Africa. Do you think Chinese investment disputes are different from other disputes or have a special character, calling for specific forums like Kajak? The no's win. 17 said they do not think so, no special character there. The yeses were 10, and the ones who were unsure were, the yeses were 11, and the ones who were unsure were 10. So with that, I have to say a huge thank you to the participants for involvement in the poll and for the invigorating, very refreshing questions that we had. I also say a huge thank you to the AFAA for the invitation and for selecting this topic, which is very timely, and to our panel of expert speakers who have really taken the time over the past few months to prepare for these presentations. And for the audience, again, thank you for your participation. Please look out for speaker papers from Kwadwo Sarkodie, Daniel Marr, Stephen Ajay, and Baptiste Rigaudot. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your sessions, and God bless you all. And I will ask my panel to please give me a big smile so that I can take a photo for future reference. Thank you, Dan. Asanteni sana, and enjoy the rest of your sessions.
Bye-bye.